In the autumn of 1847, deep within the fog-shrouded mountains of eastern Tennessee, there existed a place that seemed forgotten by God himself. Coldwater Hollow carved itself into the wilderness like a wound that refused to heal, its handful of log cabins clustered around a single dirt road that led nowhere but deeper into shadow. The people of Coldwater Hollow were not unlike other frontier settlers, weathered by hardship, bent by loss, clinging to whatever hope they could find in this unforgiving land. But there was something different about the way they moved through their daily tasks, something in their eyes that spoke of a hunger that went beyond empty bellies or harsh winters. They had found their salvation in the words of Reverend Silas Elcott. Elcott had arrived 3 months prior, emerging from the mountain mists like an answer to desperate prayers. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire, and when he spoke of God's plan for his chosen people, even the most hardened settlers felt their hearts quicken with something they had almost forgotten: hope. His church was a simple structure, built from the same rough timber as everything else in the hollow. But when Elcott preached, the walls seemed to expand, the shadows to deepen, and his voice to carry promises that no ordinary minister had ever dared make. He spoke not just of salvation in the next world, but of triumph over suffering in this one. He promised his flock that faith could conquer death itself. Among his most devoted followers was Miriam Crawford, a widow whose husband had died the previous winter, leaving her alone to raise their 10-year-old son, Elias. The boy had always been sensitive, prone to nightmares and strange fancies, but since attending Reverend Elcott's sermons, something had changed in him. Something that made Miriam's mother's heart flutter with unease, even as she tried to convince herself it was merely renewed faith. The change had begun 3 weeks ago, after a particularly intense evening service where Elcott had preached about hearing the voice of God in the silence between prayers. That night, Elias had woken screaming about a bell, a great bronze bell that rang in his dreams, calling him to come closer, to listen more carefully to what it was trying to tell him. "It's the bell of God, Mama," he had whispered, his small face pale in the candlelight. "Reverend Elcott says only the pure of heart can hear it. It's calling us home." Miriam had held him close, stroking his dark hair, but she could not shake the feeling that something cold had settled into her bones. In the days that followed, she began to notice things, the way the other children in the hollow had grown quiet and distant, how the adults spoke in hushed tones about dreams they claimed they could not quite remember, how even the animals seemed nervous, as if sensing something wrong in the very air they breathed. The hollow itself seemed to encourage such thoughts. It was a place where fog lingered long after sunrise, where shadows fell at odd angles, where the silence between the mountains felt heavy with secrets. The neighboring settlements gave Coldwater Hollow a wide berth, their trappers and traders finding excuses to take longer routes that avoided its winding trail entirely. When Miriam had asked why, old Thomas Harper from Miller's Creek had simply shaken his head and muttered something about places that God had turned his face away from. "Some ground," he had said, spitting into the dust, "ain't meant to be settled on. Some places got a taste for things that ought to stay buried." But Reverend Elcott assured his congregation that such fears were the whispers of the faithless, that God had led them to this sacred ground for a purpose greater than their understanding. The hollow was not cursed, he proclaimed. It was chosen. They were chosen. Standing in her small cabin as darkness settled over the mountains, Miriam watched her son through the window. Elias knelt in their garden, his lips moving in silent prayer, his face turned toward the church where a single candle burned in Reverend Elcott's study. The boy had been spending more and more time in prayer, often forgetting to eat, claiming that hunger brought him closer to God's voice. The bell in his dreams had grown louder, he told her. Soon, he said with a smile that chilled her, he would be able to hear it even when awake. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound drifted across the hollow, the deep, resonant toll of the church bell, though Miriam knew no one had climbed the tower to ring it. The sound seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, vibrating through the floorboards of her cabin and into her very bones. Elias lifted his head, his young face transformed by an expression of rapture that belonged on no child's features. "Do you hear it, Mama?" he whispered, his voice carrying clearly through the glass. "It's calling us. It knows we're ready." The bell tolled again, longer this time, and Miriam realized with growing horror that all across the hollow doors were opening. Families emerged from their cabins, moving like sleepwalkers toward the church, their faces blank with devotion, their children walking beside them with that same terrible smile that had claimed her son. She pressed her hand against the window, watching as her neighbors, people she had known for years, filed past her home without a glance, drawn by that impossible bell toward whatever waited in Reverend Elcott's church. And as the fog began to rise from the ground like fingers reaching toward heaven, Miriam found herself wondering, what happens to a community when faith becomes something hungry, something that demands more than prayer and devotion? What happens when salvation requires not just the surrender of doubt, but the surrender of everything that makes us human? Reverend Silas Elcott was not like any minister the people of Coldwater Hollow had known before. Where other preachers spoke of humility and service, Elcott spoke of power. Where they promised reward in the afterlife, he promised transformation in this one. And where they asked for faith, Elcott demanded surrender. He stood behind his pulpit like a man carved from shadow and flame, his tall frame seeming to stretch toward the rafters, his voice rolling through the small church with an authority that made grown men tremble. His sermons were not discussions of scripture, but proclamations of divine will, delivered with such certainty that doubt became not just foolish but blasphemous. "God does not ask us to wait," he would declare, his burning eyes sweeping across his congregation. "He does not ask us to suffer in patience while paradise remains beyond our reach. He has shown me the path to glory, and it begins here, in this sacred ground, with this chosen people." The congregation hung on his every word, their faces upturned like flowers seeking sunlight. Men who had once prided themselves on their independence now sought Elcott's counsel on every decision, from when to plant their crops to how to discipline their children. Women who had maintained their own households for years suddenly found themselves unable to sleep without first receiving the Reverend's blessing. Miriam watched this transformation with growing unease. She had tried to speak to her neighbor Sarah Whitmore about her concerns regarding young Elias's increasingly strange behavior, only to have Sarah's eyes go distant and cold. "The Reverend says worry is a sin," Sarah had replied, her voice flat and strange. "He says mothers who question God's work through their children are like Eve, bringing doubt into paradise." It was then that Miriam began to truly pay attention to Reverend Elcott himself, rather than just his words. She noticed how he never seemed to tire despite preaching for hours each night. She saw how his clothes remained clean and pressed, while everyone else in the hollow showed the wear of hard living. Most disturbing of all, she observed how he watched his congregation, not with the love of a shepherd, but with the calculating gaze of a farmer examining his livestock. The change in Elias had accelerated dramatically. The boy who had once begged for second helpings at dinner now pushed his plate away after just a few bites, claiming that Reverend Elcott had taught him that earthly hunger was a distraction from spiritual nourishment. "The Reverend says, our bodies are just shells," Elias explained one morning when Miriam found him pale and shaking from hunger. "He says, if we purify ourselves enough, we won't need food at all. We'll be sustained by God's love alone." When Miriam pressed him about who exactly had told him this, Elias's eyes took on that distant quality she had seen in Sarah Whitmore. "The Reverend teaches us many things, Mama, things the adults aren't ready to understand yet, but we children hear more clearly because our hearts are pure." The implications of this chilled Miriam to her core. What was Elcott teaching the children in private? When did he have access to them without their parents present? Her questions led her to seek out Jacob Miller, one of the few men in the Hollow who had shown any skepticism toward their new minister. But when she found Jacob, he seemed like a different person entirely, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking as he spoke. "I tried to ask around about Elcott's background," he whispered, glancing nervously toward the church. "Sent word to settlements back east, trying to trace where he came from." "What did you find?" Jacob's voice dropped even lower. His father, Josiah Elcott, was run out of Massachusetts 20 years ago. Accusations of leading some kind of secret society, practicing what folks called dark worship. They said he believed that certain places on earth were doorways to other realms, places where the faithful could transcend human limitations. And the son disappeared when he was barely grown. Some say he went looking for his father. Others claim he found something worse. Jacob gripped her arm suddenly. "Miriam, I tried to share this information with the others, but they won't listen. It's like they can't hear anything that contradicts what Elcott tells them." That night, as Miriam lay awake listening to Elias murmur prayers in his sleep, she realized the full extent of their situation. Reverend Elcott had not simply gained the loyalty of Coldwater Hollow. He had claimed their minds, their wills, their very souls. And somehow, impossibly, the children were his most devoted disciples. The next morning brought news that sent ice through her veins. 3 families reported that their children had begun sleepwalking, found at dawn kneeling in the church cemetery, their knees muddy and their hands stained with earth. When questioned, the children claimed they had been preparing the ground for God's garden. That evening, as the congregation gathered for another of Elcott's sermons, Miriam made a decision that terrified her. She would attend, but she would not listen with the blind faith of the others. She would watch and remember and try to understand what spell this man had cast over her community. But as she walked toward the church, Elias's small hand in hers, she could not shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap that had been carefully laid long before Reverend Elcott had ever set foot in Coldwater Hollow. The fog rose around them like reaching fingers, and somewhere in the distance that impossible bell began to toll again. Behind them, their cabin stood empty and dark, as if the land itself was already beginning to forget they had ever lived there at all. The forest surrounding Coldwater Hollow had always been a place of shadows and secrets, but as October deepened, it began to feel like something alive and watching. Ancient oaks and towering pines pressed close to the settlement's borders, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so thick that even midday felt like dusk beneath their cover. It was in these woods that the first signs of true wrongness began to manifest. Tom Bradley, the Hollow's most experienced hunter, had disappeared 3 days into October while tracking deer along the familiar trails he had walked for 15 years. His wife found his rifle abandoned beside Coldwater Creek, its barrel aimed toward the settlement, as if he had been watching something approach from the forest depths. When a search party ventured out to find him, they discovered things that made even the bravest men turn back before noon. Animals, rabbits, squirrels, even a young bear had been found arranged in careful patterns throughout the woods. Not killed by predators or disease, but placed deliberately, their bodies forming symbols that resembled the strange markings carved into the support beams of Reverend Elcott's church. The symbols meant nothing to most of the searchers, but they filled them with an inexplicable dread, as if looking upon them too long might invite some terrible attention. Miriam learned of these discoveries through whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Reverend Elcott's most devoted followers drew near. The community was dividing itself without anyone speaking of it openly. Those who questioned what they saw in the woods, and those who seemed incapable of seeing anything troubling at all. Her son Elias belonged firmly to the second group. The boy had begun disappearing at night, slipping from his bed to wander the forest paths in nothing but his nightclothes. Miriam would find him at dawn, standing among the trees with dirt under his fingernails and leaves in his hair, his lips moving in prayers she could not understand. When she tried to ask where he had been, his young face would take on that distant expression that had become so familiar and so frightening. "I was walking with the others, Mama," he would say, his voice carrying an odd rhythm, as if he were reciting words someone else had taught him. "We were preparing the sacred spaces. The Reverend says the forest remembers the old ways, and we must help it remember completely." Other children had begun exhibiting similar behavior. Mary Hutchins, only 7 years old, was found one morning standing in a circle of dead rabbits, her small hands folded in prayer. When her mother tried to pull her away, Mary began speaking in what sounded like Latin, though neither she nor anyone in her family had ever learned that ancient tongue. The parents who noticed such things were discovering that their concerns fell on deaf ears. Those who had given themselves completely to Reverend Elcott's influence seemed genuinely unable to perceive anything troubling about their children's behavior. They spoke instead of spiritual awakening, of young souls so pure they could commune with God in ways adults had forgotten. But Miriam was not entirely alone in her fears. Late one evening, as she kept vigil by her window to prevent Elias from wandering, she saw a figure moving carefully between the cabins. It was Rebecca Shaw, whose daughter had been among those found in the cemetery. Rebecca moved like a woman trying not to be seen, glancing frequently over her shoulder as she approached Miriam's door. "I know you've noticed it too," Rebecca whispered when Miriam let her inside. "The way they look at us when we ask questions, the way they seem to hear things we can't hear." Together, they shared their observations in hushed voices. How the devoted congregants had begun to move in unison during services, swaying and humming in perfect harmony without any apparent signal. How the children spoke of dreams filled with the great black sun that would rise over their church when the faithful had proven themselves worthy. How even the weather seemed to bend to Reverend Elcott's will, fog appearing when he needed privacy for his private meetings, rain stopping the moment he emerged from the church. "My Emma drew a picture yesterday," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "She called it the mouth that will swallow the light. It showed our church, but underneath it was this terrible opening in the earth, filled with teeth." Miriam felt her blood turn to ice. Elias has been drawing similar things. Doors beneath the church floor, stairs leading down into darkness. When I ask him about them, he says the Reverend showed him in a dream. They agreed to watch more carefully, to document what they observed, to try to understand what was happening to their community before it progressed too far. But even as they made these plans, both women knew they were already isolated, already marked as those who lacked true faith. The next morning brought proof of how precarious their position had become. Sarah Whitmore approached Miriam outside the general store, her once friendly face now cold and disapproving. "The Reverend mentioned that some among us are struggling with doubt," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for others to hear. "He said doubt is like a sickness that can spread if we're not careful." Other women nodded in agreement, their eyes holding a glassy quality that made Miriam's skin crawl. "Perhaps," Sarah continued, "those who cannot embrace God's work should consider whether they truly belong among the faithful." The message was clear: question Reverend Elcott's influence and risk being cast out entirely. In a place as isolated as Coldwater Hollow, excommunication would mean death, if not from exposure and starvation, then from whatever waited in the woods beyond the settlement's borders. That night, as Miriam lay awake listening for any sound that might indicate Elias was trying to slip away again, she heard something that froze her heart. From somewhere deep in the forest came the sound of children singing, a hymn she recognized from church services, but changed somehow, the melody twisted into something that sounded less like worship and more like summoning. She crept to her window and peered into the darkness. There, barely visible through the trees, she could make out small figures moving in procession, their white nightgowns ghostly in the moonlight. At their head walked a tall, familiar silhouette, leading them deeper into the woods toward some purpose she dared not imagine. When morning came, every child in the settlement bore fresh scratches on their hands and faces, as if they had been crawling through brambles. But when their parents asked about the wounds, the children only smiled and spoke of gathering offerings for the sacred feast. And in the distance, just barely audible above the wind, came the sound of that impossible bell, tolling a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of Miriam's terrified heart. The announcement came on a Sunday morning when the autumn air carried the first sharp bite of approaching winter. Reverend Elcott stood before his congregation, his gaunt frame seeming to absorb rather than reflect the pale light filtering through the church windows. "The time of preparation has come," he declared, his voice resonating through the small building with an authority that made the very walls seem to lean inward. "God has spoken to me in visions. He demands proof of our devotion, evidence that we trust in his providence above all earthly concerns." Miriam felt her stomach clench as she watched the faces around her light up with rapturous attention. Even Elias, sitting beside her, leaned forward with an eagerness that frightened her. "For 40 days and 40 nights," Elcott continued, "we shall fast as Christ fasted in the wilderness. We shall consume nothing but water, and the Holy Communion bread I will provide. In doing so, we will purify our bodies and souls, making ourselves worthy vessels for God's ultimate blessing." The congregation erupted in murmurs of excitement and devotion. Miriam looked around in growing horror as she realized that no one was questioning this potentially deadly command. 40 days without food would kill the children, the elderly, anyone already weakened by the harsh frontier life. But when she opened her mouth to voice her concerns, her neighbor Samuel Cross placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "The Reverend speaks God's will," he said, his eyes holding that glassy quality she had come to dread. "Those who doubt show themselves unworthy of salvation." The fast began the next morning. Within a week, the effects were visible throughout Coldwater Hollow. Adults moved slowly, their faces drawn and pale. Children who had once played and laughed now sat quietly, their eyes large and sunken in their small faces. The elderly began to take to their beds, too weak to maintain their daily routines. Yet strangely, the most devoted followers seemed to grow more energetic rather than less. They attended increasingly frequent prayer services, their voices growing stronger as their bodies grew thinner, their devotion burning brighter as their flesh wasted away. Miriam watched in growing desperation as Elias transformed before her eyes. Her son, once a sturdy boy who delighted in running through the woods, became a pale wraith who spent his days in prayer and his nights drawing intricate symbols that hurt her eyes to look upon. "The hunger is leaving me, Mama," he told her one evening, his voice carrying an otherworldly serenity that chilled her. "The Reverend says when we stop needing earthly food, we become ready for heavenly nourishment." She tried to force him to eat, hiding bread in his clothes or slipping milk into his water, but he refused everything with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than outright rebellion would have been. It was Rebecca Shaw who brought Miriam the most disturbing news of all. "I followed them last night," Rebecca whispered during one of their secret meetings, held in the abandoned root cellar behind her cabin. "The children, when they do their midnight wandering, they go to the cemetery, but they're not just praying." "What do you mean?" "They're digging, Miriam. With their bare hands they're opening graves, old graves, from before the settlement was established. And when they find bones," Rebecca's voice broke, "they carry them to the church." The implications of this revelation sent ice through Miriam's veins. What was Reverend Elcott building in his church, using the bones of the long dead? What purpose could such desecration serve? Her answer came 3 days later, when she noticed that Elcott himself showed no signs of the wasting that affected his congregation. If anything, the minister seemed more robust than ever, his tall frame filling out rather than thinning, his eyes burning with an energy that seemed to feed on the weakness of his flock. Late one night, driven by desperation and maternal fear, Miriam crept from her cabin and made her way toward the church. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her days. Through a crack in the boards that covered the church's rear window, she watched Reverend Elcott kneeling before what appeared to be an altar made entirely of human bones. The skeletal remains had been arranged in complex patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight, forming symbols that made her mind reel when she tried to focus on them. But it was not the macabre altar that filled her with terror. It was what Elcott was doing beside it. The minister knelt over a large wooden bowl filled with what looked like thick, dark liquid. As Miriam watched in horror, he lifted the bowl to his lips and drank deeply, his throat working to swallow whatever vile substance it contained. When he lowered the bowl, his lips were stained black, and his eyes reflected the candlelight like those of a nocturnal predator. Around him, arranged in careful rows, sat loaves of bread, the same bread he distributed to his starving congregation as their only sustenance during the fast. But now Miriam could see that the bread was not the simple flour and water it appeared to be. It glistened with moisture, and when Elcott began to speak over it in that same strange language the children had been using, the loaves seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She understood then what was happening. The fast was not purifying the congregation. It was weakening them, making them dependent on whatever corrupt nourishment Elcott provided. The children were not being enlightened. They were being prepared, transformed into something other than human. As if sensing her presence, Elcott suddenly raised his head and looked directly toward the window where she hid. In the candlelight, his face appeared almost skeletal, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones, his smile revealing teeth that seemed too white and too sharp for any human mouth. Miriam fled through the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs as she heard the church door open behind her. But she did not dare look back to see if he followed, did not stop running until she reached her cabin and barred the door behind her. Inside she found Elias standing by his bed, his young face turned toward the church with an expression of perfect, terrible peace. "The Reverend is calling, Mama," he said without looking at her. "Soon we'll be ready for the final feast. Soon we'll never be hungry again." And in the distance, growing stronger with each passing night, came the sound of that impossible bell, tolling the rhythm of a heartbeat that belonged to something far older and more terrible than any god she had ever been taught to worship. October 31st dawned gray and cold, with a fog so thick it seemed solid, pressing against the windows of Coldwater Hollow's cabins like searching fingers. Despite weeks of fasting, despite the growing weakness that should have kept them bedridden, every member of the congregation rose before sunrise, drawn by a compulsion stronger than their failing bodies. Miriam woke to find Elias already dressed in his Sunday clothes, standing by their cabin door with the patient stillness of someone waiting for an appointed time. His young face, now gaunt from weeks of near starvation, held an expression of anticipation that made her blood run cold. "Today is the day, Mama," he said without looking at her, his voice carrying that strange rhythmic quality that had become his normal way of speaking. "Today we receive our reward for faithfulness. The Reverend has promised that after today we'll never hunger again." Throughout the settlement, similar scenes played out. Families emerged from their cabins moving like sleepwalkers, their faces blank with devotion, their children leading them toward the church with an eagerness that seemed to burn brighter as their bodies grew weaker. Miriam dressed with hands that trembled, knowing she had no choice but to follow. In the weeks since beginning their investigation, she and Rebecca Shaw had discovered the fate that awaited those who refused to attend Elcott's services. Two families who had expressed doubts had simply vanished one night, their cabins left empty, their belongings undisturbed, as if they had simply stepped outside and never returned. The church doors stood wide open, revealing an interior lit by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. But as the congregation filed inside, Miriam noticed something that filled her with dread. Men she did not recognize stood at the doors, watching each person enter with cold, calculating eyes. They wore the simple clothes of settlers, but something about their bearing suggested they were anything but ordinary frontier folk. Inside the church, the familiar space had been transformed. The simple wooden pews remained, but the walls were now covered in symbols carved deep into the timber, the same twisted markings she had seen in the forest clearings and in her son's disturbing drawings. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. Reverend Elcott stood behind his pulpit, but he too seemed transformed. His tall frame appeared even more imposing than usual, his dark clothes seeming to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. When he smiled at his arriving congregation, Miriam could swear his teeth looked sharper than they had before. "My beloved flock," he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church, "you have proven your faith through sacrifice. You have shown God that you trust His providence above all earthly concerns. Today your devotion will be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams." As he spoke, Miriam realized with growing horror that the church doors had been quietly closed behind the last stragglers. Worse still, she could hear the sound of heavy bars being slid into place, sealing them inside. The service began like any other, with hymns and prayers, but as the hours passed, something began to change. The singing took on an otherworldly quality, voices blending in harmonies that seemed impossible for human throats to produce. The prayers shifted from English into that strange ancient language the children had been speaking in their sleep. Miriam tried to catch the eye of other parents, looking for signs that someone else recognized the danger they were in. But everywhere she looked, she saw only faces transformed by religious ecstasy, eyes that reflected the candlelight like those of wild animals. It was when Reverend Elcott called for the children to come forward that Miriam's terror reached its peak. One by one, the smallest members of the congregation rose from their seats and walked toward the pulpit with the mechanical precision of marionettes. Elias among them, his pale face glowing with an inner light that seemed to come from somewhere other than the flickering candles. "These innocents," Elcott proclaimed, gesturing toward the assembled children, "have heard God's voice most clearly. Their pure hearts have made them perfect vessels for His glory. They will lead us now to the place He has prepared." Moving with careful ceremony, several of the strange men Miriam had noticed earlier began to lift wooden planks from the area directly in front of the pulpit. As the flooring was removed, a terrible smell rose from beneath, the reek of decay and something else, something that made her stomach turn and her mind rebel against understanding. What they revealed defied all reason and sanity. Beneath the church floor lay a vast pit, its edges lined with stones that looked far older than the settlement itself. The excavation stretched down into darkness so complete that the candlelight could not penetrate it, but the smell rising from its depths spoke of death and corruption beyond imagining. And arranged around the pit's edge, gleaming white in the candlelight, were hundreds of human skulls. "Behold," Reverend Elcott declared, his arms spread wide as if embracing the horror he had revealed, "the mouth of God Himself, the gateway through which the faithful pass from this world of suffering into eternal glory." The congregation responded not with screams of terror, but with sighs of rapturous joy. Parents reached for their children with hands that shook, not from fear, but from religious fervor. The sight of that blasphemous pit seemed to fill them with the same anticipation that might have greeted the opening of heaven's gates. But Miriam's maternal instincts finally overcame the paralysis of shock. As Elias moved toward the edge of the pit with the other children, she lunged forward and grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all her remaining strength. "No!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the otherworldly atmosphere like a knife. "Whatever you think this is, it's not salvation, it's death." Her words broke the spell for just a moment. Several parents seemed to wake from their trance, confusion and horror dawning on their faces as they truly saw what lay before them. But that moment of clarity lasted only seconds before Elcott's voice rose again, drowning out dissent with words that seemed to bypass the mind and speak directly to something deeper and more primal. Chaos erupted in the locked church. Those who had been jolted awake by Miriam's outcry tried to reach their children, while those still under Elcott's influence moved to stop them. In the confusion, Miriam managed to drag Elias toward the back of the church, seeking any escape from the nightmare unfolding around them. It was then that she noticed the narrow stairs leading to the small gallery above the main floor, a space used for overflow seating during larger services. If she could reach it with Elias, perhaps they could hide until whatever madness was planned had passed. But as she climbed those stairs, pulling her increasingly resistant son behind her, she heard Reverend Elcott's voice rise above the chaos with words that would echo in her nightmares for the rest of her life. "Fear not the passage, my beloved. Death is only the door, and faith is the key that opens it." And from somewhere far below, deeper than any pit should reach, came the sound of that impossible bell, tolling with a rhythm that matched the beating of her terrified heart. From her hiding place in the gallery, Miriam watched in horror as Reverend Elcott restored order to his congregation with nothing more than his voice. Those who had momentarily broken free from his influence seemed to sink back into their trance, their faces once again assuming that expression of peaceful devotion that had become so terrifyingly familiar. Beside her, Elias struggled against her grip with surprising strength for a child weakened by weeks of fasting. "Let me go, Mama," he whispered, his voice carrying that alien rhythm that no longer sounded like her son. "The Reverend is waiting. Everyone is waiting. We have to go down." Below them, the congregation had arranged itself in orderly rows facing the pit. Men, women, and children sat with perfect stillness, their faces turned toward Elcott like flowers following the sun. In the candlelight, they looked less like people than like statues carved from shadow and hunger. "My faithful ones," Elcott began, his voice carrying easily through the church despite speaking barely above a whisper, "you have endured the fast. You have purified your bodies and souls. You have proven yourselves worthy of God's ultimate gift." He gestured toward the pit, and Miriam could swear she saw something move in its depths, not the scurrying of rats or insects, but something vast and patient, waiting in the darkness below. "This sacred opening has existed since before your settlement, before the Cherokee walked these mountains, before any human foot touched this ground. It is older than memory, older than scripture, older than the gods your ancestors worshipped in their ignorance." As he spoke, several of the strange men began distributing wooden cups to the congregation. The liquid within was dark and thick, and it seemed to move of its own accord, swirling in patterns that hurt Miriam's eyes to follow. "Drink," Elcott commanded, "and prepare yourselves for transformation." Without hesitation, the congregation lifted their cups in unison and drained them completely. Almost immediately, their expressions changed from mere devotion to something approaching ecstasy. Their eyes began to reflect the candlelight with an inner glow, and when they spoke, their voices blended into harmonies that no human throat should have been able to produce. What happened next would remain burned into Miriam's memory until her dying day. One by one, beginning with the eldest members of the congregation, people began to stand and walk calmly toward the edge of the pit. There was no fear in their movements, no hesitation or doubt. They approached that blasphemous opening as if it were the most natural thing in the world, their faces radiant with joy. Elder Morrison was the first to reach the edge. The old man who had been among the settlement's founding members stood for a moment, looking down into the darkness, then spoke in a voice filled with wonder. "I can see it. I can see the glory waiting below." And then, without another word, he stepped forward and disappeared into the pit. No scream echoed up from the depths. No sound of impact reached their ears. It was as if he had simply been absorbed by the darkness itself. The congregation responded with a collective sigh of approval, as if they had just witnessed the most beautiful thing imaginable. Another person stood, then another, each moving toward the pit with the same peaceful determination. Families went together, husbands and wives holding hands as they approached the edge, children skipping alongside their parents as if they were heading to a picnic rather than to their deaths. The Hutchins family, the Bradleys, the Crosses, all people Miriam had known for years, reduced to sleepwalkers marching toward oblivion. "We have to go down, Mama," Elias said again, his struggles becoming more violent. Everyone's going down. The Reverend says it's beautiful down there. He says we'll never be cold or hungry or sad, ever again. Miriam held him tighter, tears streaming down her face as she watched her neighbors vanish one by one into that terrible opening. She wanted to scream, wanted to break the spell that held them, but she knew that any sound would draw attention to their hiding place. As the night wore on, the pit seemed to grow more active. Faint sounds began to echo up from its depths. Not human voices, but something like singing, if singing could be done by creatures that had never possessed human vocal cords. The candlelight began to flicker in patterns that suggested movement far below, as if whatever waited in the darkness was stirring in response to the offerings it received. It was when Rebecca Shaw approached the edge with her young daughter Emma that Miriam finally understood the full scope of the horror. As Rebecca prepared to step forward, she turned back toward the remaining congregation and spoke in a voice filled with rapturous joy. "I can feel them calling to us from below. All those who went before, they're waiting to welcome us home. They're so happy, so perfect. They want us to join them in the glory." And then she and Emma were gone, swallowed by the darkness as completely as if they had never existed. The church bell began to toll again, that impossible sound that seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from any bronze bell in any tower. With each toll, more people stood and walked toward the pit, until fewer than a dozen remained in the pews. It was then that Reverend Elcott looked directly up at the gallery, where Miriam hid with her son. "Come down, Miriam Crawford," he called, his voice carrying clearly, despite the distance between them. "Bring the boy. The passage is almost complete, but it cannot close until all the faithful have entered." Elias's struggles became frantic. "He's calling us, Mama. We have to go. Everyone's waiting for us." But Miriam held fast, even as she saw Elcott begin to climb the stairs toward their hiding place. His movement was wrong somehow, too fluid, too quick, as if his joints bent in ways that human joints should not bend. "You cannot save him by hiding," Elcott said as he reached the top of the stairs. Up close, Miriam could see that his face had changed completely. His skin was pale as parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed sharper than before. His eyes reflected the candlelight like those of a nocturnal predator, and when he smiled, his teeth appeared longer and more pointed than any human teeth had a right to be. "The boy has already heard the call. His soul already belongs to what waits below. You can join him willingly, or you can watch as he is taken from you piece by piece." Below them, the last of the congregation was disappearing into the pit. Soon the church would be empty, except for the three of them and whatever unseen presences filled the shadows. The bell tolled one final time, a sound so deep and resonant that it seemed to come from the very foundations of the world. And in that moment of perfect, terrible silence that followed, Miriam made her choice. She would not let them take her son, no matter what the cost. The sun rose on November 1st to reveal a sight that would haunt the surrounding settlements for generations to come. Coldwater Hollow sat in perfect, unnatural silence, its cabins standing open to the morning air like empty eye sockets in a skull. The first to notice the wrongness were trappers from Miller's Creek, men who had reluctantly agreed to check on the isolated settlement after weeks of unnatural weather, fog that lingered far too long, winds that carried sounds like voices speaking in unknown tongues, and that persistent tolling of a church bell that echoed across the mountains at all hours. What they found defied understanding. Every door in the settlement stood ajar, revealing interiors that looked as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-task. Meals sat half-prepared on tables, their contents now rotting in the cool air. Fires had burned down to cold ashes in hearths where clothing and personal belongings were laid out as if their owners had intended to return within minutes. But most unsettling of all was the complete absence of human remains. Not a single body, not a drop of blood, Not even a scrap of clothing to suggest what had become of the 43 souls who had called Coldwater Hollow home. Thomas Harper, the lead trapper, later described the feeling that settled over him as he walked through the empty settlement. It was like walking through a place that had been abandoned for years, except everything was too fresh, too recent, like someone had taken all the people and just erased them from the world, leaving everything else exactly as it was. The church drew their attention immediately. Unlike the cabins, its heavy oak doors were sealed tight, barred from the inside with thick wooden beams that would have required multiple men to move. But when the trappers managed to break through, using axes and crowbars brought from their own settlement, they found an interior that challenged their sanity. The building reeked of decay and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded Harper of flowers left too long in a tomb. Candles had burned down to puddles of wax on every surface, suggesting that whatever had happened here had taken place over many hours. But it was the floor that stopped the men in their tracks. Where the simple wooden planking should have been, a gaping hole stretched across the front of the church. The opening was perfectly circular, its edges cut with a precision that suggested tools far more sophisticated than anything the settlers would have possessed. The excavated earth had been piled neatly around the perimeter, mixed with what appeared to be fragments of human bone. But the pit itself was empty. Harper lowered a torch on a rope into the opening, watching as the light descended 15 feet 30, before finally illuminating the bottom. What he saw there would later be dismissed by the magistrate as the fevered imaginings of a man traumatized by the scene, but Harper swore until his dying day that the bottom of that pit was lined with symbols carved directly into the living rock, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight as if they were alive. More disturbing still were the scratches covering the inside walls of the pit, gouges in the earth that could only have been made by human fingernails, hundreds of them, as if people had tried desperately to claw their way back to the surface. But the scratches all pointed downward, as if those who made them had been trying to dig deeper rather than escape. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless. Magistrate William Carver arrived from the county seat with 6 deputies and a determination to find rational explanations for what had occurred in Coldwater Hollow. But each discovery only deepened the mystery. Reverend Silas Elcott's personal effects were found in the small room behind the church that had served as his study, but among his few possessions, the investigators discovered things that raised more questions than they answered. Books written in languages none of them could identify, detailed maps of underground cave systems that didn't match any known geography of the region, and most disturbing of all, meticulous records of his congregation's genealogies going back generations. Every family in Coldwater Hollow could trace their lineage to specific regions of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont, areas that had been plagued by accusations of witchcraft and devil worship in the previous century. It appeared that Elcott had not chosen his location randomly, but had deliberately sought out the descendants of those who had fled religious persecution decades earlier. The investigators also found evidence of the extended fast that had weakened the congregation in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Stores of food sat untouched in root cellars and pantries, while strange, moldy loaves of bread were discovered throughout the settlement, bread that gave off the same sweet, cloying odor that permeated the church. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was made in the forest surrounding the settlement. Following paths that seemed to radiate outward from the church like spokes of a wheel, the investigators found clearings where the ground had been disturbed in careful patterns. Excavations revealed more human bones, far too many to have come from the missing congregation alone, and far too old to have been buried recently. Carbon deposits in the soil suggested that fires had burned in these clearings for decades, perhaps centuries. Local Cherokee, when cautiously questioned, would only say that their ancestors had avoided this particular valley, claiming it was a place where the hungry earth demanded tribute. The official report filed by Magistrate Carver listed the disappearance of Coldwater Hollow as a case of mass migration, suggesting that the entire population had abandoned their settlement and moved west, perhaps to California or Oregon. But privately, Carver confided to his closest associates that he believed something far more sinister had occurred, something that challenged the very foundations of Christian civilization. The settlement was officially abandoned, its deeds transferred to the state, and within 5 years the forest had begun to reclaim the empty cabins. But strange reports continued to filter in from hunters and trappers who ventured too close to the old settlement boundaries. They spoke of voices heard singing hymns in the depths of the woods, of lights moving beneath the ground on moonless nights, and most persistently of a church bell that continued to toll at all hours, though the church itself had long since collapsed and no bell tower remained standing. The mystery of Coldwater Hollow was sealed away in government archives, dismissed as frontier superstition and mass hysteria. But in the mountains of eastern Tennessee there were still those who remembered, who passed down warnings to their children about places where the earth itself had developed an appetite for human souls. And sometimes, on October nights when the fog rolled thick through the valleys, travelers claimed they could still hear that impossible bell, calling to anyone foolish enough to listen for the voices of the faithful who had answered its summons and never returned. 6 months after the disappearance of Coldwater Hollow, Magistrate William Carver received orders from the territorial governor to conduct a more thorough investigation into what had become known as the Tennessee Vanishing. Rumors and wild stories were spreading throughout the region, affecting trade routes and discouraging new settlement in areas deemed spiritually compromised by superstitious settlers. Carver assembled a team of investigators that included Deputy Marshal John Pierce, Surveyor David Whitman, and Dr. Edmund Salt, a physician and amateur naturalist from Nashville. Their mandate was simple: find rational explanations for the events at Coldwater Hollow and put an end to the rumors that were hindering territorial expansion. What they discovered over the course of 3 weeks would challenge their understanding of both history and human nature. The investigators began by examining the physical evidence that remained at the abandoned settlement. Dr. Salt's analysis of the mysterious bread found throughout the hollow revealed disturbing properties. The loaves contained not just flour and water, but traces of unknown organic compounds that appeared to induce a mild narcotic effect when consumed. More troubling still, microscopic examination revealed what appeared to be spores of some unknown fungal organism embedded throughout the bread structure. The consumption of this material over an extended period, Dr. Salt noted in his report, would likely result in significant alterations to both cognitive function and physical health. The subjects may have experienced hallucinations, increased susceptibility to suggestion, and a gradual deterioration of critical thinking abilities. Surveyor Whitman's examination of the church's foundation revealed construction techniques that predated European settlement of the region by centuries. The stonework beneath the wooden structure showed clear evidence of Native American origin, but incorporated elements that didn't match any known tribal construction methods in the area. Most significantly, ground-penetrating surveys revealed that the pit beneath the church was part of a much larger network of natural caves and artificial tunnels that extended deep into the mountain. The tunnel system appeared to connect with similar excavations at sites throughout the region, sites that local Cherokee guides reluctantly identified as places their ancestors had considered sacred and dangerous. But it was Deputy Marshal Pierce who uncovered the most disturbing evidence about Reverend Silas Elcott himself. Tracing Elcott's background through territorial records and correspondence with authorities in Massachusetts, Pierce discovered that the man who had led Coldwater Hollow to its doom was part of a family with a long history of involvement in religious extremism and occult practices. Josiah Elcott, Silas's father, had indeed been expelled from Massachusetts in 1823 following accusations of leading a secret sect that practiced what contemporary accounts described as devil worship and human sacrifice. But the elder Elcott had not disappeared as local legend suggested. Instead, he had relocated to Tennessee and spent years identifying and contacting the descendants of families who had fled earlier witch trials. The investigation revealed that Josiah Elcott had established at least 3 other isolated settlements in Tennessee and Kentucky, each populated by families whose genealogies traced back to accused witches and devil worshippers from New England, and in each case, the settlements had eventually vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only empty buildings and whispered stories of religious mania. Silas Elcott appeared to have inherited both his father's mission and his methods. Records found hidden beneath the church revealed detailed correspondence with other ministers throughout the region, men who shared the Elcott's belief that certain bloodlines carried a spiritual heritage that made them ideal candidates for transcendence. These letters spoke of ancient knowledge preserved in oral traditions, of sacred sites where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, and of rituals that could grant the faithful passage to realms of eternal glory. Most chilling of all, they referenced a network of underground chambers connected by natural cave systems, places where the old gods still held sway, and where proper offerings could ensure communion with powers beyond human understanding. Dr. Salt's examination of the bone fragments found throughout the region supported these disturbing theories. Carbon dating revealed that human remains had been deposited in the area's cave systems for over 300 years, with the practice intensifying during periods that coincided with witch trials and religious persecution in New England. It appears, Dr. Salt concluded, that successive generations of religious extremists have used this region as a destination for those seeking to escape persecution, only to subject them to practices far more sinister than anything they fled. The investigators also uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation. Elcott's personal journals, written in a cipher that took weeks to decode, revealed detailed observations of his congregation's behavior and carefully planned methods for inducing dependency and compliance. He had used a combination of enforced fasting, narcotic substances, sleep deprivation, and social isolation to break down his followers' resistance to increasingly extreme demands. The process was gradual but systematic, designed to replace rational thought with religious fervor and to create a community so dependent on his leadership that they would literally follow him to their deaths. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Elcott had not acted alone. The investigation revealed that several of the men who had appeared in Coldwater Hollow during its final weeks were not simple settlers but trained accomplices who had helped orchestrate similar disappearances at other locations. These men appeared to operate as part of an organized network that identified vulnerable communities, established control through charismatic religious leadership, and then guided their victims toward participation in rituals that resulted in their complete disappearance. The final piece of the puzzle came when Deputy Marshal Pierce discovered a cache of documents hidden in a cave system 20 miles from Coldwater Hollow. These papers, preserved in waterproof containers, contained detailed maps of underground chambers throughout the region, instructions for conducting passage rituals, and most chilling of all, schedules that indicated the Coldwater Hollow disappearance was just one event in a much larger pattern. According to these documents, similar operations were planned for communities throughout the Tennessee mountains, each timed to coincide with specific astronomical events, and each targeting populations that shared the same genealogical markers as the Coldwater Hollow settlers. But the investigators' work was cut short when political pressure from territorial authorities forced them to abandon their research and seal their findings. The official explanation cited concerns about public panic and interference with westward expansion, but Carver suspected that more powerful interests were at work, interests that did not want the full truth about the regional disappearances to become public knowledge. The investigators' complete files were classified and stored in territorial archives, accessible only to government officials with specific authorization. but copies of their findings were secretly distributed to local law enforcement agencies throughout the region, along with warnings to watch for similar patterns of religious extremism and community isolation. Their work had revealed that the disappearance of Coldwater Hollow was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of exploitation that had been ongoing for generations. Somewhere in the mountain caves of Tennessee, forces older and more dangerous than any conventional religious movement continued to operate, drawing victims from communities too isolated and vulnerable to resist their influence. And despite the investigators' efforts, there was no indication that these forces had been stopped, only that they had become more careful about covering their tracks. 37 years after the night of vanishing at Coldwater Hollow, a group of surveyors mapping timber claims in the remote Tennessee mountains made a discovery that would reopen old wounds and challenge official explanations of what had transpired in that forgotten settlement. Hidden in a narrow valley less than 5 miles from the original hollow, they found a crude shelter built against the face of a limestone cliff. The structure was little more than stacked stones and salvaged timber, but it showed clear signs of long-term habitation. More intriguingly, it was occupied. The woman they found living there appeared to be in her 70s, though malnutrition and exposure had aged her beyond her years. Her hair was white as fresh snow, her skin weathered and scarred, and her eyes held the distant quality of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. When the surveyors first approached, she fled deeper into her shelter like a wild animal, speaking in a voice cracked from years of disuse. It took days of patient coaxing before she would allow them close enough to speak with her properly. When she finally did, the words she spoke sent chills through men hardened by frontier life. "I am Miriam Crawford," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "I was there the night they all went down. I was there when the earth opened its mouth to swallow the faithful." The surveyors knew enough local history to recognize the significance of her claim. Miriam Crawford had been listed among the missing residents of Coldwater Hollow, vanished along with her young son, Elias, during that mysterious night in 1847. If this woman was telling the truth, she was the only known survivor of whatever had befallen the settlement. Word of her discovery reached authorities within days, and soon Dr. Edmund Salt, now elderly but still sharp of mind, made the journey to interview the woman who claimed to be Coldwater Hollow's sole survivor. What he learned during those interviews would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Miriam's account of the final night at Coldwater Hollow matched what the investigators had theorized but could never prove. She described Reverend Elcott's systematic manipulation of his congregation, the enforced fast that had weakened their resistance, and the horrific ceremony that had culminated in the entire community willingly descending into that blasphemous pit. But her testimony revealed details that no amount of forensic investigation could have uncovered. "They didn't die," she told Dr. Salt, her clouded eyes fixed on something only she could see. "Not the way death is supposed to work. When they went down into that darkness, they were changed, transformed into something that could serve whatever waited below." According to Miriam, she had managed to hide in the church rafters with Elias as the ceremony reached its climax. But her son, already deeply under Elcott's influence, had struggled against her grip with inhuman strength. "He wasn't my boy anymore," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her weathered cheeks. Something else was looking out through his eyes, something hungry and patient and old. When I tried to hold him back, his skin felt cold as winter stone, and his voice wasn't his own. She described how Elcott had eventually discovered their hiding place, how he had climbed toward them with movements that defied human anatomy. But when he reached for Elias, Miriam had made a desperate choice that saved one life while damning another. Using a broken piece of timber from the gallery railing, she had struck Elcott across the face with all her remaining strength. The blow had sent him tumbling back down the stairs, but not before he had managed to grab Elias and pull the boy with him. "I heard him calling to me as they fell," Miriam sobbed. "Not Elias. The thing that was wearing my son's face. It promised me that if I came down willingly, I could be with him forever in the glory below. But I ran instead. God help me. I ran and left my baby to whatever was waiting in that pit. Her escape from the church had been harrowing. The building was still barred from the inside, but years of harsh weather had weakened some of the boards. She had managed to kick out a section of wall planking and squeeze through the gap, emerging into a night filled with unnatural sounds. The whole settlement was singing. She remembered every voice I'd ever known but changed somehow. They were calling from below the ground, from places deeper than any grave should reach. The song was so beautiful, it nearly pulled me back, nearly made me want to dig down through the earth with my bare hands just to join them. Instead, she had fled into the forest, driven by maternal grief and supernatural terror. For weeks, she had wandered the mountain trails, surviving on roots and stream water, gradually making her way deeper into the wilderness, where no sane person would think to look for her. But the mountains had not let her escape completely. "They call to me still," she told Dr. Salt. "On clear nights when the wind is still, I can hear them singing beneath the earth. All the voices of Coldwater Hollow, joined together in hymns that no human throat should be able to sing. And sometimes, when the loneliness gets too heavy to bear, I hear Elias among them." Her isolation had been broken only rarely over the decades. Occasionally, hunters or trappers would stumble across her shelter, but she had learned to hide from such encounters. Most who glimpsed her assumed she was a wild woman, a hermit driven mad by solitude. But her madness, if madness it was, had a peculiar consistency that troubled Dr. Salt. Despite her obvious mental deterioration, her account of events never varied, never contradicted itself, never showed the embellishments or false memories that typically characterized delusional thinking. More disturbing still were the drawings she had made over the years, scratched into stone walls and carved into pieces of wood. They depicted the same symbols the investigators had found beneath Coldwater Hollow's church, rendered with an accuracy that suggested she had studied them extensively during that final night. But it was her final revelation that convinced Dr. Salt that Miriam Crawford was indeed who she claimed to be, and that her testimony contained more truth than any rational mind wanted to accept. "He's still out there," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the deeper mountains. "Elcott. He walks the old trails on moonless nights, still gathering the faithful, still promising them passage to glory. I've seen him from a distance, tall and gaunt as ever, but wrong somehow, like a shadow that learned to walk upright." She claimed that other settlements had vanished over the years, communities that had attracted Elcott's attention through their isolation and religious fervor. Each time the pattern was the same. A charismatic preacher would arrive, promising salvation through sacrifice, and within months the entire population would simply disappear. "The earth is hungry in these mountains," Miriam concluded, her voice fading to barely a whisper. "It's been hungry for so long that it's learned to call people to feed it. And there are still those who know how to listen to its voice, how to prepare the offerings it craves." Dr. Salt left the interview profoundly shaken. Here was confirmation of the investigators' worst theories, delivered by the one person who had witnessed the truth and lived to tell it. But he also knew that Miriam Crawford's testimony would never be accepted by any official authority, would never be allowed to challenge the sanitized version of events that had been written into the territorial records. 3 months after Dr. Salt's visit, surveyors returning to the area found Miriam Crawford's shelter empty. No signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. Just another mysterious disappearance in mountains that seemed to specialize in swallowing people without a trace. But sometimes, on nights when the wind carried sounds across the valleys, travelers in those remote regions reported hearing a woman's voice calling through the darkness, not in distress, but in warning, urging them to turn back from paths that led toward places where the earth itself had learned to hunger for human souls. Today, more than a century and a half after the night of vanishing at Coldwater Hollow, the site remains a place that maps seem reluctant to acknowledge and compasses struggle to navigate toward. The Tennessee Department of Natural Resources lists it as environmentally sensitive wetland, discouraging casual visitation, though no scientific surveys have ever documented any endangered species or unique ecosystems in the area. Hikers who venture into those particular mountains often report navigation difficulties, trails that seem to shift when no one is looking, paths that lead in circles despite careful attention to landmarks, and a persistent feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Most turn back before reaching the valley where Coldwater Hollow once stood, driven away by an instinctive unease they cannot rationally explain. But some have persisted, drawn by curiosity or academic interest or simple human stubbornness. Their accounts, dismissed by authorities as folklore and superstition, paint a picture of a place where the past refuses to stay buried. The settlement itself has long since been reclaimed by forest growth, its cabins reduced to moss-covered foundations, and its roads transformed into deer paths. But the church site remains strangely clear of vegetation, a roughly circular patch of bare earth where nothing has grown for over a century. Modern visitors describe the area as profoundly unsettling, marked by an unnatural silence that seems to absorb sound rather than simply reflecting it. Birds avoid the region entirely, and even insects seem reluctant to venture onto that barren ground. The temperature remains noticeably cooler than the surrounding forest, regardless of season or weather conditions. But it is the nights that truly test the courage of those who dare to camp in the vicinity of Coldwater Hollow. Local legend maintains that on October 31st each year, the anniversary of the vanishing, the ancient church bell can still be heard tolling across the mountains. Rational explanations have been offered for this phenomenon: wind through cave systems, settling of underground stone formations, even acoustic mirages caused by unusual atmospheric conditions. But those who have actually heard the tolling describe it as something far more deliberate than any natural occurrence. The rhythm follows the pattern of a heartbeat, they claim, or perhaps the cadence of a funeral march played at half speed. And beneath the bronze resonance of the bell itself, sensitive ears can detect something else: the sound of voices raised in harmony, singing hymns in a language that predates any known human tongue. Dr. Margaret Thorne, a folklorist from Vanderbilt University who conducted extensive research in the region during the 1990s, documented over 40 separate accounts of supernatural encounters at the Coldwater Hollow site. Her subjects ranged from local hunters and park rangers to visiting scholars and ghost enthusiasts, but their descriptions shared remarkable consistency. Almost everyone reports the same basic experience. Dr. Thorne noted in her unpublished manuscript on Tennessee mountain folklore, a sense of standing at the edge of something vast and hungry, something that recognizes them as potential sustenance. Many describe feeling an almost overwhelming urge to dig into the ground with their bare hands, to excavate something that they somehow know is waiting just beneath the surface. Several visitors have reported discovering the remnants of Reverend Elcott's church foundation, though official surveys indicate that no such structure should exist at the site. These witnesses describe finding carefully arranged stones that form a perfect circle around a depression in the earth, stones that feel unnaturally warm to the touch despite the ambient temperature. Some claim to have seen symbols carved into these foundation stones, the same twisted markings that appeared in the original investigators' reports, patterns that seem to shift and flow when observed directly. Attempts to photograph these symbols invariably result in blurred or distorted images, as if the camera equipment malfunctions when pointed at the carvings. But perhaps most disturbing are the accounts of those who claim to have encountered Reverend Silas Elcott himself, still walking the mountain trails after all these years. These sightings follow a consistent pattern, a tall, gaunt figure glimpsed at the edge of vision, always moving deeper into the forest, always just far enough away that clear identification remains impossible. Witnesses describe an immediate sense of recognition, as if some part of their subconscious mind identifies the figure, despite never having seen him before. Those brave or foolish enough to follow these sightings report being led along paths that seem to appear and disappear at will, trails that wind deeper into the mountains toward destinations that maps insist do not exist. The few who have pressed on despite growing unease describe finding other cleared sites similar to Coldwater Hollow, circular patches of bare earth marked by stone foundations, and that same unnatural silence. Local Cherokee elders, when cautiously approached about the region, speak of places where the hungry earth still demands tribute, sites where their ancestors left offerings to appease forces that should not be awakened. They describe Coldwater Hollow as one of several bleeding grounds throughout the mountains, places where the boundary between the world of the living and something else has worn dangerously thin. Some ground remembers, explained Joseph Crow Feather, a tribal historian interviewed by Dr. Thorne in 1994. It remembers the taste of what was offered to it, and it develops an appetite for more. White settlers came to these places thinking they could build their own sacred spaces, but they didn't understand what they were building on top of. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to study the Coldwater Hollow site using contemporary equipment, but their results have been uniformly inconclusive. Electronic devices malfunction with disturbing regularity in the area. Recording equipment captures only static or incomprehensible whispers, and temperature readings fluctuate wildly without apparent cause. But the human cost of such investigations has been significant. 3 separate research teams have reported members going missing during overnight studies at the site, only to have these individuals found days later wandering in distant parts of the forest with no memory of how they arrived there. In each case, the missing researchers described dreams of descending into underground chambers filled with singing voices and promises of eternal peace. The official position of state and federal authorities remains unchanged from the original territorial investigation. Coldwater Hollow represents a historical curiosity, a frontier settlement that was abandoned due to harsh conditions and economic hardship. The supernatural elements attached to its history are dismissed as folklore and local superstition, natural outgrowths of the isolation and harsh living conditions that characterized frontier life. But for those who have experienced the reality of what lingers in those mountains, no amount of official denial can erase the knowledge that some hungers are too ancient and too patient to be satisfied by rational explanation. The question that haunts researchers and visitors alike is not whether something supernatural occurred at Coldwater Hollow. The evidence for that is overwhelming, even if it cannot be officially acknowledged. The question is whether what happened there was an isolated incident, or whether it represents something far more widespread and ongoing. In the mountains of eastern Tennessee, there are still places where settlements have vanished without explanation, where communities have simply emptied themselves of human life and been reclaimed by forest growth. Local records often list these disappearances as cases of westward migration or economic collapse, but the patterns are disturbingly similar to what occurred at Coldwater Hollow. And sometimes, on October nights when the fog rolls thick through the valleys, travelers in those remote regions still report hearing the sound of church bells tolling in rhythm with their own heartbeats, calling to something deep within them that remembers what it means to have faith in forces older and hungrier than any god humanity has ever chosen to worship. The mouth of God remains open in those mountains, patient and eternal, waiting for the faithful to answer its call. And in a world where isolation and desperation continue to drive people toward promises of salvation at any cost, there will always be those ready to provide exactly the kind of faith that such hungers demand. Perhaps Reverend Silas Elcott was right about one thing. The faithful were indeed led exactly where their faith promised to take them. The only question that remains is whether salvation and damnation are truly different destinations, or simply different names for the same inevitable end.